Okay, we are just going to continue on with some of our factoring completely this week. There was one on the quiz you guys had last week. It had something like x to the fourth plus x to the third plus x. And when you see that, you can see it's not a quadratic, so you have to factor that out and take an x out of each of those. So then, whoops, this would be a squared. So we would take an x squared out of each of those, and then we'd have x squared plus x plus 1. Your guys had some coefficients there, so it was a little bit different, but this is mainly what we're going to be focusing on this week and trying to really solidify how to do these problems where we have to pull out a greatest common factor before we start the other factoring process. So you guys did pretty good on your quizzes this week. This upcoming week, so the 20th through the 24th, you guys have a quiz, and it's going to be all problems kind of like this one. So it's a little tougher. I dropped our mastery level down a little bit for this quiz, not because you don't have to try as hard, or not because I don't want you to try as hard, but because these problems are a little bit harder. And these are really getting into some Algebra 2 stuff. So if you guys are getting these, your mastery level at this point isn't as high as it would be when you go over these again in Algebra 2. You guys still need to try really hard on these because these are going to be tougher. That's why I dropped down the mastery level. So make sure you're trying your best. But I don't want you to stress on the quiz if there's one of them that you're just not getting. Because I think I made even mastery, so getting a green, available even if you missed one. So just keep that in mind while you're doing the quiz. It's going to be a little bit tougher this week, but your mastery levels drop down. Okay, we're going to start out with this problem just because it's kind of an easy start to getting used to pulling out that greatest common factor again. Remember, that's always what we want to do first with these, is pull out our greatest common factor. This one doesn't have a constant term, so we're just going to have to pull out a greatest common factor. We can see that 3 would go into each of these, and that x would go into each of these. So let's go ahead and pull out a 3 and an x. Now 3 times 2 is 6, so we're going to have a 2. X times x is x squared. Then 3 times negative 1 is negative 3, and x times 1 is x. So we're not going to even put the 1 there because negative 1 times 1 is just negative 1. So this would be our final answer. I'm going to rewrite it because that looks a little sloppy. It's 3x times 2x minus 1. And the reason we know this is our final answer is because this is not a quadratic. We can't factor that further. And there is not another common factor that we can pull out of there. Also, 3x is not factorable further. So that one is also final in its final version. So this would be our final answer. Okay, and we're going to do this one now. It's going to give us just a little bit of a start. And how I'm going to kind of do this with you guys for this lesson, it's pretty similar to how we've been doing it. But I'm going to do one, and then I'm going to have you do one that's very similar. And then I'm going to do one that's a little different. And then you're going to do one that's similar to the one that I just did. So that you guys get to see one and then do one, and hopefully that helps you with your practice a little bit. So I wrote down some steps here, and we're going to make sure that we follow all of these steps to get to our final factored form. So the first thing that I'm going to do is pull out my greatest common factor. And I have to look at my numbers, or my coefficients, and then I also need to look at my variables. So, if I look at those numbers, the greatest common factor that I can pull out of there, we're actually going to do a negative, because see this leading coefficient, how it's negative? If that's ever negative, go ahead and pull out a negative. Remember that a negative times a positive is a negative. A negative times a negative is a positive. You're going to have to remember those rules when you're doing this. So I think that I can pull out a -2 from everything here. So I'm going to go ahead and do that. I'm going to pull out a -2. Now, if we look at our variables, we can see there is not one with our constant term. That means we cannot pull out a variable as well. However, if there was a variable right here, say there was an r, we could pull something out. There isn't in this case, so we're not going to pull anything out. Okay, so now we are just going to figure out what's left. So -2 times 2 is 4. And then we have an r squared. -2 times 1 is -2. So I'm going to do plus just r because it would technically be 1r. And then -2 times -3 is 6. So see how that changed that sign? If you're pulling out a negative and you have a positive to start with, a negative times a negative is a positive. So you have to make sure that you're paying attention to your negatives and positives with this. So this was our first step. We did our greatest common factor. I'm going to go ahead and mark that off. Now it says I need to make my box. So I'm going to make my box. And my first term goes in my first box, so 2r squared. Remember, we're kind of ignoring this first part for now. We're going to pretend that we're just factoring 2r squared plus r minus 3. Okay, and my last term goes in my last box. So my box is created. Now I need to do my diamond. So I have to put in my top box -6r squared. In my bottom box is going to be r. And I think I can fill this in with -2r and 3r. Because if I multiply those, I will get -6r squared. If I add those, I will get r. So my diamond is done. Now I need to complete my box with my diamond stuff. So I'm going to have -2r and 3r. So I completed my box. Now I need to factor the box. So I can pull out a 3 up here, and I would be left with an r, and it looks like a -1. Now I can pull a 2r out down here, and I would be left with an r and a -1 again. So then we're just left with r and -1. Okay, we've factored our box. Now it says write down final factors and don't forget your GCF, which means greatest common factor. So this step up here, don't forget that factor that we factored out there. So that's the first thing I always write down. So I take this down here and I have a -2 first. Now this is one of my factors and this is one of my factors. So I'm going to have 2r plus 3 and r minus 1. And that would be my final answer. So I would encourage you to make sure you have this problem completely written down with all of the steps and everything, because then you can look back at it on the next problem when you need to look back at it if you're lost or whatever. These steps that are here on this right hand side, if you want to make yourself a little cheat sheet that you make sure you go through these boxes every single time and do all of those things, do it. I would maybe even add a little box down here with your don't forget your greatest common factor, because that's one of the areas that I think a lot of people miss, is they'll just write 2r plus 3 times r minus 1, and they'll forget that they pulled out that negative 2 in the beginning. So that's a really important step as well. Okay, here's the problem that I'm going to have you guys do. It is very similar. The only kind of different thing is you won't have to factor out a negative number because this leading coefficient is positive. So don't worry about that. I wrote your guys' steps over on the right hand side for you, so I would go ahead and write those on your paper and write the problem down and make sure you're following those steps and make sure you're doing everything that's on there. So go ahead and pause right now. When you press play again, I'm going to have the problem done with my work. It's super important that you try this on your own though, because I just did one with you, so this is your chance to see if you are getting it. So go ahead and pause. Okay, so here is my work and my final answer, and let's go ahead and just walk through this and see what I did. So my first step up here, I factored out a negative 2, so I did my greatest common factor. Then I created my box. I did my diamond. I took these from my diamond and put them in my box to complete my box. One thing I want to point out here, an area where you could have a few mistakes. I got negative 6n and negative 4n. And when I first looked at this, I thought that I was going to use 2 and 12 somehow, because 24 divided by 2 is 12. And 2 and 12 look like they could get to negative 10, but you just can't get there with positives and negatives. So you have to use that negative 6 and negative 4. Now, over in my box, this is another area where you could kind of have some mistakes. And I'm going to erase really quick. I'm just going to walk you through this part how I did it because it's a little tricky because we have a negative and a negative but a positive. So we have to remember our rules with negatives and positives. So what I did first was say up here I can pull out a 4. If I pull out a 4, I'm left with negative n. And then here I'm left with 2. Now I'm going to pull out a 3n, and that leaves me with n and negative 2. So if you look at this, you can see that we have a negative 2 and a positive 2. That doesn't correspond, right? We have an n and we have a negative n. So I need to fix something before I can move on. When this happens, all you guys have to do is make this constant term negative. So I'm going to make that a negative 4. And that would make this n, positive n, and this negative 2. That fixes my problem. So then I am left with exactly what I had before, which is n and negative 2. And then I just wrote down my factors. So we finished our factoring box, wrote down our final factors. Make sure you don't forget your 2 from the very beginning. And that was your greatest common factors. So that is that whole problem. Okay, these are getting a little trickier now. And this is going to be very similar to what you're going to see on the homework and on your quiz. So when you first look at this problem, you can see this is not a quadratic because our leading term is cubed. That means it's not a quadratic. So we need to figure out what we're going to pull out of these to make it a quadratic. We want that leading one to be a squared term. So I am going to just pull out an x of all of these. So my greatest common factor with all 3 of these is an x. Now the other piece I need to look at is my coefficients. Remember, the negatives go with them. So when I look at these, I need to find the largest number that can go into all 3 of them. And I think that largest number is a 3. So now we just need to fill this in, and I'm going to make this the same color. So 3 times 5 is 15. X times x squared is x cubed. Now 3 times negative 18 is 54, and x times x is x squared. Now 3 times negative 8 is 24, and x times 1 is just x, so we just are left with our 8. So now you can see what is in the parentheses is our quadratic that we're going to be factoring. So we found our greatest common factor. Let's go ahead and make our box now. So we have our first term in our first box, our last term in our last box, and our box is made. Now we need to make our diamond. And our top part is going to be 5x squared times negative 8, which is negative 40x squared. And our bottom part is just the middle term, which is negative 18x. Now, when I look at this, I can kind of just see what it's going to be. So 40 divided by 2 is 20. So we're going to use 2x and 20x, but we need to find which one needs to be negative. So we have a negative 18, so the larger one needs to be negative, and then if I add 2 to that, I would get 18. If I multiply these now, I would get negative 40x squared. So we did our diamond. Now let's fill in our box with those. So negative 20x and 2x. And now we just need to factor our box. So I'm going to start with the top, and I can pull out a 2 from each of those, and I'd be left with an x and a negative 4. Now I can pull out a 5x from each of these, and I would be left with an x and a negative 4 again. So I'd have x minus 4. Now we need to write down our factors, so 5x plus 2, x minus 4, but then don't forget your greatest common factor, which is 3x. And that would be my final answer. So go ahead and write this down if you didn't write it down while I was going through it, so that you can look at it while you're doing your problem. The next thing I'm going to do is put up a problem for you to do and try on your own. So make sure you have this written down so that you can look back at it. Okay, so as you can see, this is a very similar problem. It's not a quadratic because this is a 3. So you need to make it a quadratic by finding your greatest common factor first. This is super, super similar to the one we just did. So go ahead and pause here. When you press play again, you will see my work and you can check your work. Okay, here is my answer. So let's walk through what I did. So first I pulled out 3k because that is my greatest common factor. Then I made my box over here. Then I did my diamond. And honestly, that was the hardest part of this one, was finding the negative 15k and the 4k. You just have to figure out which factors of 60 are going to work to get negative 11. Then I filled in my box with that negative 15k and that 4k. Then I took out my factors here on the sides. And then I just wrote down these factors down here. And then lastly, I need to make sure I put my negative or my 3k from the beginning back in there. And that was it. Okay, this is the last type of problem we're going to go through. And it's still very, very, very similar. Except for now, instead of our leading term having a cube term, it is now to the 4th. So that tells me I'm going to have to pull something out that's bigger. So I'm going to look at all of these pieces. And the first thing I can see is I can pull out an r squared from all of those. Now, I'm going to look at all of my leading coefficients, and I can pull out a 2 from all of those. So now 2 times 5 is 10, and then we have r times r squared times r squared is r to the 4th. 2 times 7 is 14, and r times r squared is r to the 3rd. 2 times negative 6 is 12, and then r squared times 1 is r squared, so it's just going to be negative 6 there. So I did my greatest common factor. Now let's do our box. Okay, my first term goes in my first box. My last term goes in my last box. Now I need my diamond. Now we're going to have negative 30 r squared. Remember, you just multiply the first term and the last term to get that. Then my middle term goes in my bottom box. Okay, now I think my factors are going to be 10r and 3r. I need to make one of those negative though, so 10 minus 7, or minus 3 is 7. 10 times negative 3 is negative 30. So we're going to have negative, oh, we did our diamond. We're going to have negative 3r and 10r. Now I need to factor my box. So I'm going to have negative 3, and I'd be left with r and 2. And I'd have 5r, whoops. And I would be left with r and 2 as well. So we have r and 2. So we've finished factoring our box. Now we need to write down our factors of 5r minus 3 and r plus 2. Just as a rule of thumb, you guys, I didn't do this on one of the problems, but usually if you have a coefficient with an r and then not with the other one, usually you write the one with the coefficient first. It doesn't really matter that much, but that's how you'll see it on your homework and your quiz. So I wrote down my final factors, but I need to do my greatest common factor still, so I need this 2r squared as well. This would be my final answer. Okay, this is the very last problem. This one I want you guys to attempt on your own again. So go ahead and press pause, and when you press play again, you will see the answer. Okay, here is my answer. So let's go ahead and go through it really quick. Up here I pulled out a 3r squared. That was my greatest common factor. Then I created my box. Then I filled in my diamond and found out that negative 10r times r is negative 10r squared, and negative 10r plus r is negative 9r. I filled my 1r and my negative 10r into my box, and then I pulled out my greatest common factors from my box. I wrote down those factors, so that one was here, this one was here, and then lastly I needed to remember my 3r squared. So this would be my final answer. Okay, that is it. This is pretty similar to your guys' homework and your quiz. If you have questions, please make sure you ask questions. I hope you took the opportunity to do those problems on your own that I had you doing on your own on this video, because that's really where you guys are going to get your learning from. That's where you're going to get practice that is guided by your teacher from. On your guys' homework, I attached the answers to the very end. So what I would suggest doing is on the homework, I would do a problem, check your answer at the end. If you didn't get the right answer, go back and try to get the right answer. And if you can't get there, email me and ask me questions and I will help you through it. And then once you're done with that, go to the next question and do the same thing to do the whole homework. The quiz is very similar to the homework, just like it was last week. So make sure you email me and ask me if you have any questions. Good luck, guys.